The factory worker stopped mid-twist of his wrench when a pilot's angry voice echoed across the Bell production floor in Buffalo. "I'm not flying that death trap." It was March 1942, and yet another test pilot had just refused to take up the Bell P-39 Airacobra. He was the fifth to reject it that week. The brand-new fighter gleamed under the hangar lights, fresh paint still drying on its unusual mid-engine fuselage. Everything about the aircraft looked like the future. Tricycle landing gear, a powerful 37mm cannon mounted in the nose, a clean aerodynamic profile. But the pilots assigned to fly it had a different label for this ambitious design. They called it a flying coffin. And the timing of these rejections made things even harder to accept. America desperately needed fighters. Buffalo's factories were running around the clock, 7 days a week, racing to produce enough planes to fight two global enemies. Yet here stood a fresh design that no one wanted to take into combat. British pilots had flown it and promptly canceled their orders. The French never received theirs before their country fell. American aviators reviewed the specs and immediately asked to be reassigned to literally anything else. Even Bell's own test pilots were beginning to lose confidence. To a casual observer, nothing seemed wrong. The P-39 looked fast, modern, and carried more firepower than nearly any frontline fighter. That nose-mounted 37mm cannon could punch through armored aircraft or ground vehicles with ease. And on paper, the engineering was inspired. By placing the Allison engine behind the cockpit, Bell's design team created ideal weight balance and freed up room in the nose for that huge gun. A long drive shaft ran under the pilot's feet to reach the propeller through a complex gearbox. But elegant theory collided with brutal physics. That long shaft generated constant vibration transmitted through the entire airframe, making precise flying extremely difficult. Pilots said flying it felt like sitting on a violently shaking washing machine. Even worse, shifting the engine behind the pilot meant every major mechanical failure exploded toward the cockpit. In typical fighters, you saw trouble brewing ahead of you. In the P-39, disaster erupted from behind, often announced only by fire creeping up your back. Before continuing, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what you know about Soviet air combat. Drop a comment and let me know whether you've ever heard about the P-39's incredible Eastern Front record. And if you enjoy deep dive aviation history like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. We put a lot into researching these details, and knowing you're here makes it worth it. The aircraft's most crippling limitation appeared the moment pilots tried to climb. The Allison V-1710 engine, strong down low, suffocated at higher altitudes. Anything above 12,000 feet turned into a desperate struggle. That wasn't a minor annoyance, it was lethal. German Bf-109s cruised at 25,000 feet. Japanese Zeros operated even higher. A P-39 tasked with intercepting incoming bombers would lumber upward while enemy fighters swooped down from above with every advantage in speed and positioning. Colonel Bruce Holloway, tasked with evaluating the aircraft in early 1942, wrote a harsh report that circulated through Army Air Force leadership. The Airacobra was utterly unsuited for high-altitude interception. Its ceiling was too low, its climb rate collapsed above 10,000 feet, and its handling at those heights became dangerously unpredictable. He could not recommend it for combat against the Luftwaffe. That kind of review should have doomed the entire project. In any normal procurement system, a fighter incapable of performing its intended mission would be scrapped, and the factory redirected to something better. But wartime logistics weren't normal. America was still staggering after Pearl Harbor. Factories were being expanded, new workers trained, supply lines established. Canceling the P-39 would mean shutting down a full production chain and rebuilding something different from the ground up. The lost time would be catastrophic, months, possibly years. So production continued. Buffalo workers kept riveting together fuselages and installing engines into planes that U.S. and British pilots wanted nothing to do with. The aircraft sat abandoned in storage fields across the United States,
rows of unwanted fighters gathering dust while the war raged on without them. And then, unexpectedly, a solution emerged. The Soviet Union, locked in a desperate struggle against the German invasion, needed aircraft, any aircraft. Through diplomatic channels, Joseph Stalin made it unmistakably clear he required huge numbers of fighters, bombers, and tanks, and he needed them immediately. The United States, determined to keep the Eastern Front active and support its ally, began shipping equipment under Lend-Lease. Among those shipments were hundreds of P-39 Airacobras that no one else wanted. American officials quietly viewed this as a convenient way to dispose of a problematic fighter, while technically meeting Soviet demands. Their logic was simple: send the airplanes we can't use, keep the better ones for ourselves, and let the Soviets figure something out. And if the P-39 performed as poorly in Soviet hands as it had for American pilots, then at least the losses wouldn't be American. The journey to Russia was long and hazardous. The fighters were loaded onto ships at U.S. ports, sailed through waters haunted by U-boats to the Persian Gulf, disassembled, then hauled overland across Iran into southern Russia. It took months. Some were damaged in handling, others never arrived, lost to German submarines. But by late 1942, the first P-39s were reaching Soviet airfields, and the reception they received was entirely different from what they had faced in the West. Soviet pilots approached the Airacobra with no preconceived biases. High-altitude performance meant nothing to them. They weren't fighting high-altitude battles. Over the Eastern Front, the air war was violent, chaotic, and mostly fought below 10,000 feet. German Stukas attacked at low level. Soviet pilots struck tanks at treetop height. Dogfights turned into savage, swirling duels close to the ground, exactly the environment where the P-39's Allison engine excelled. The first Soviet units to receive the Airacobra treated it as an experiment. Compared to the Lag-3, a wooden, underpowered, lightly armed fighter it often replaced, the P-39 was a revelation. Its 37mm cannon could tear a German bomber apart with a single hit. Its rugged construction allowed it to survive punishment that would have shredded the fragile Lag-3. And at low altitude, it was actually faster and more maneuverable than many German fighters. Senior Lieutenant Grigory Rechkalov was among the earliest Soviet pilots to take the Airacobra into combat. His first report, written in October 1942, highlighted how differently Soviet aviators judged performance. The American machine is heavy but durable. It does not climb well, but it dives with tremendous speed. The cannon is excellent. Today I destroyed a Ju-88 with 3 shells, the entire tail section separated. This aircraft rewards aggression and punishes hesitation. That mindset, attack boldly and never hesitate, became the core of Soviet Airacobra tactics. Pilots exploited its strengths and avoided its flaws. They struck quickly from a favorable angle, fired a deadly burst, and disengaged before enemy fighters could react. In the right hands, the P-39 transformed from flying coffin into a ruthless predator. No pilot proved that more than Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin, later one of the most famous Soviet aces. Born in 1913 in Novosibirsk, he began the war flying outdated MiG-3s, struggling against technically superior German planes. When he transitioned to the P-39 in early 1943, he immediately understood what it could do. Pokryshkin developed a tactical doctrine built specifically around the Airacobra, his formula for air combat. It emphasized altitude advantage, energy control, and disciplined marksmanship. His fighters patrolled around 15,000 feet, scanning for German formations below. Once they spotted targets, they would dive rapidly, close to near point-blank range, unleash the 37mm cannon, and then climb steeply away before the enemy could react. The method was devastating. Pokryshkin's personal tally climbed quickly: 5 victories, then 10, then 20. By the time the Battle of Kursk erupted in July 1943, he was the leading Soviet ace, and his regiment, flying American-built Airacobras, had become one of the most formidable units in the Red Air Force. German pilots recognized his radio call sign and frequently warned each other, Achtung, Pokryshkin ist in der Luft. The Battle of Kursk revealed the strengths of the P-39 on a grand scale. Germany launched its final major offensive in the east, thousands of tanks and aircraft committed to break Soviet lines. The Luftwaffe brought its elite units, expecting to seize air superiority quickly. Instead, they ran into Soviet P-39 squadrons whose pilots had spent months refining their tactics. During the first week alone, Pokryshkin's regiment claimed more than 100 German aircraft destroyed. Pokryshkin himself recorded 23 confirmed kills that July. The German advance, which depended heavily on air cover, found itself constantly disrupted by Soviet fighters that attacked suddenly and retreated before the Luftwaffe could organize a defense. The Airacobra's cannon proved especially lethal against U-87 Stukas, which were slow and highly vulnerable. Reports of the P-39's successes on the Eastern Front began reaching American intelligence by mid-1943, and were initially dismissed as exaggeration. The same fighter American pilots refused to fly was apparently one of the most potent weapons in Soviet service. Some analysts assumed it was simply propaganda to make U.S. forces feel better about shipping outdated aircraft. But the evidence kept building. Soviet procurement officers formally requested more P-39s, not P-51 Mustangs, not P-47 Thunderbolts, specifically more Airacobras, the very plane U.S. test pilots had walked away from.
By 1944, the Soviet Union was receiving P-39s in the thousands, and Soviet fighter aces were using them to achieve victory counts rivaling the top American and British pilots. Pokryshkin ended the war credited with 59 aerial victories, every single one achieved while flying American-built fighters, mainly the P-39. The dramatic contrast in the aircraft's reputation came down to the conditions under which it was used and the tactical mindset behind it. American fighter doctrine in 1942 focused on intercepting bombers and escorting them at high altitude. The P-39 had been specifically designed for that mission and completely failed. Soviet doctrine focused instead on low-altitude support of ground forces and seizing local air superiority. For those tasks, the Airacobra was nearly ideal. The same traits that doomed it in the West made it extremely valuable in the East. Back in the United States, Bell Aircraft's engineers learned from the P-39's contradictory legacy. Its shortcomings revealed serious structural and performance limitations, but its battlefield successes validated some bold design choices. The tricycle landing gear, initially seen as a risky departure from traditional tail-dragger fighters, proved vastly superior. It offered clearer forward visibility on the runway, reduced the risk of ground accidents, and helped inexperienced pilots handle the aircraft safely. Bell engineers began developing a refined successor, the P-63 King Cobra. This aircraft kept the P-39's general layout but incorporated a more powerful engine, aerodynamic refinements, and improvements based directly on feedback from Soviet combat pilots. Like the Airacobra, the P-63 would see minimal American combat service, but the Soviets would receive many of them and use them with considerable success. More importantly, the design lessons from the P-39 shaped the future of American fighter development. Tricycle landing gear rapidly became standard in U.S. aircraft. Bell's emphasis on excellent visibility, improved through the P-39's distinctive cockpit design, became a priority in subsequent fighters. And the concept of mounting heavy weapons in the nose, validated by the performance of the 37mm cannon, strongly influenced future armament philosophy. When Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson designed America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, in 1943, the resulting aircraft bore noticeable design lineage from the P-39. tricycle landing gear, improved forward view, and the engine positioned behind the pilot. In the P-80, this was required by jet technology rather than gun placement, but the resemblance showed clear evolutionary continuity. The P-80 became what the Airacobra had tried and failed to be, taking forward the successful concepts while eliminating the underlying weaknesses. The relationship between the poorly regarded P-39 and America's jet age breakthrough wasn't a coincidence. It was progress driven by hard lessons. The P-39's struggles at altitude forced engineers to take supercharging and high-altitude performance seriously. Its achievements in Soviet hands proved that a fighter's success depended on how and where it was used. Mission profile, environment, and doctrine shaped whether a plane was a failure or a triumph. Alexander Pokryshkin, the Soviet ace who mastered the Airacobra, finished the war with 59 confirmed kills, making him the second highest-scoring Allied fighter pilot, behind only Ivan Kozyudev with 62. Pokryshkin earned the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. In his memoirs, he praised the P-39 as the finest fighter he had ever flown. The American machine taught me everything essential about air combat. It rewarded skill and punished errors. It gave me the tools to survive and the weapons to destroy my enemies. More than 4,700 P-39s went to the Soviet Union, nearly half of total production. Soviet aviators flew them from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin, achieving thousands of aerial victories against the Luftwaffe. These were the same planes British and American pilots had rejected, the same aircraft nicknamed flying coffins by Western test pilots. In Soviet service, they became symbols of victory. Production in Buffalo finally ceased in August 1944, after 9,584 P-39s had been built in multiple variants. The workers who assembled them had absorbed only the negative rumors, the complaints from American pilots, the reputation of failure, and never knew that their handiwork was helping turn the tide of the greatest land war in history. By 1950, the P-39 had almost completely vanished for military duty. Jet fighters now dominated the skies, pushing propeller-driven machines into obsolescence. Nearly all remaining Airacobras were scrapped, melted down for their aluminum. Only a handful survived as museum pieces, reminders of a design that was both condemned and celebrated in equal measure.
Yet the influence of the aircraft continued long after it disappeared from frontline service, embedded in every American fighter that came after it. The story of the P-39 Airacobra challenges the comfortable assumptions we often make about technological progress and military strength. It shows that success and failure depend heavily on context, that a design can be considered both deeply flawed and remarkably effective, depending on how and where it is used. It also demonstrates that innovation frequently comes from unexpected places, and that real progress rarely follows a clean or predictable path. U.S. aircraft designers who once mocked the Airacobra's radical layout eventually adopted many of its ideas in their own jet fighters. Soviet pilots handed the aircraft as cast-offs from their allies, turned it into one of their most formidable weapons of war. The contradictions of the P-39 shaped American aviation for generations, teaching engineers that brilliance and disaster can exist within the same machine, and that the difference between the two often lies in the mission. The designers at Bell Aircraft never intended to create a controversial fighter redeemed only by a foreign air force. They imagined a cutting-edge aircraft that would dominate aerial battles with its unprecedented firepower and radical internal arrangement. When American pilots rejected their creation and labeled it a flying coffin, the disappointment must have been profound. Even so, their risk-taking, including features that initially seemed misguided, helped form the backbone of American jet fighter development. The factory workers in Buffalo who built nearly 10,000 Airacobras showed a different kind of courage. They continued their work with skill and commitment, despite knowing that many American pilots wanted nothing to do with the airplane. They kept the assembly lines running when logic argued for shutting them down. Their diligence ensured that when the Soviet Union desperately needed fighters, aircraft were ready to send. Today, the few surviving P-39s sit in museums near Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and other celebrated American fighters of World War II. Exhibit plaques usually describe the Airacobra as a flawed aircraft that found unexpected success in Soviet hands. While true, that description misses the deeper importance of its history. The P-39 symbolizes the messy reality of innovation, where lessons learned from failure are just as crucial as those gained from triumph. The fighter nobody wanted ultimately taught American designers everything required to build world-class air power. Its weaknesses exposed major gaps in engineering knowledge. Its success on the Eastern Front proved that a fighter must be tailored to real battlefield conditions. Its innovative features, improved and refined, became standard in the jet age. The flying coffin ended up forming part of the foundation beneath America's future air superiority. When the North American F-86 Sabre, the U.S.'s premier jet of the Korean War era, took to the skies in 1947, it carried the Airacobra's design legacy: tricycle landing gear that improved ground handling, unmatched pilot visibility, and the understanding that fighter design must combine many competing requirements thoughtfully. Those lessons were not theoretical. They were earned through disappointment, rejection, and the surprising victories of Soviet pilots. The history of the P-39 Airacobra reminds us that simple judgments rarely tell the whole story. The plane, dismissed as America's worst fighter, contributed more to U.S. aviation advancements than many aircraft America celebrates. The machine pilots refused to fly enabled Soviet aces to achieve some of the war's highest victory totals. The program, viewed as a failure, helped shape the future of aerial warfare. Sometimes the machines we abandon teach us more than the ones we praise. And sometimes what looks like the worst becomes the foundation for the best.